So moving on to a slightly different subject, I'd really like to discuss a bit about de-extinction, which is another project that you've been involved in and written about a little bit. It's a very obviously intriguing area of science, the subject of movies like Jurassic Park. Could you talk a little bit about the kinds of technologies that might be used to bring extinct animals, plants perhaps, back from extinction? What kinds of animals might be brought back? What kinds of technologies would be used?
Right. So like many of these projects, we need to both be able to read ancient DNA and then write it again. We don't necessarily have to write everything from scratch, although it might be increasingly convenient to do so as the price drops exponentially. There's a long list of organisms that people find attractive either for pure charismatic reasons or for their impact on conservation of existing species or for conservation of environments. Like the woolly mammoth is my favorite of the long list for many reasons. One is helping the Asian elephant as an endangered species by extending its range, its habitat to this huge ecosystem in the Arctic, which is very low human population density. So that would reduce that particular conflict. And also, not only is it advantageous to the Asian elephant, but also potentially to the environment that we should care deeply about, because as it melts, it releases a lot of carbon dioxide and methane, which are global warming gases, so much so that it's twice the carbon just by melting that you would get from burning all the forests of the world. So it's really a very significant amount of carbon.
And how might woolly mammoths being introduced to the tundra there prevent the release of these methane deposits?
So there were two theoretical arguments that I know of that have turned into experimental. One is that in the summertime, it knocks over trees and removes the dead grass, so the grass can be one of the dominant species, and it has high reflectance in the summer, reflects the warming sunlight, and then in winter it punches through the deep insulating layer of snow so that the cold air can penetrate. And those two combined now has experimentally been determined by mimicking the impact of an elephant mammoth, and results in this is done by the Zimov team in Siberia, a 20-degree centigrade observed difference between the control and the experimental plots. Now, that may or may not be hold up, but I think it will, and I think it's in the right direction. So it's yet another argument in favor of the extinction of this particular species. But more broadly, we're talking about conservation of species, conservation of the Asian elephant, just adapting it to a modern environment, which is extremely cold or extremely warm or dry or what have you.
Right, a different environment than perhaps it existed when the animal was originally existed.
Or a different environment from what exists today in their current environment.
So there's another. There's the idea of de-extincting extinct animals or endangered animals. One of the other possibilities that you've raised before is the idea of bringing back some of our own close relatives, certain hominins like the Neanderthal, which might be theoretically possible through certain synthetic biology techniques. Is this something that it's obviously more speculative? Is there really much interest in doing this kind of thing, bringing back a closely related hominin species?
I think there's interest in testing hypotheses. When you just reading DNA is not that necessarily that informative. You need to test the ideas. But I think bringing back the species, there haven't been as clearly articulated advantages as there have been for the elephant, and there's additional ethical boundaries. Like I said earlier, even changing one base pair in the germline is considered requires exceptional motivation and proof of safety and efficacy. I think the way that the slippery slope could happen, if you consider it positive or negative slippery slope, would be we'll start with patients that have, let's say, male infertility that can only be fixed. What would normally be somatic gene therapy in this case would also affect their germline, but in a very benign way, where you're not creating something new that's never been before. You're just returning to the healthy, fertile form for their sperm stem cells. And then it's a small step from that to curing diseases like Tay-Sachs, where you have two carrier parents who would have very severely affected children, maybe 25% of them. If you alter the male germline, then you effectively make them no longer a carrier. I mentioned that only in the context of your question about other types of humans. Is we need to get great confidence and comfort with these small medically significant changes before we would even have an informed conversation about more radical departures. But they could be very informative about behavioral and neural diversity, but there may be other approaches to that as well.